So I guess Lulu Wilson's the horror sequel savior. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today we're going to be continuing my Conjuring universe review series with the 2017 supernatural horror prequel, Annabelle Creation. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, ranked lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Annabelle Creation stars Talitha Bateman, Lulu Wilson, and Stephanie Sigman, and was directed by David F. Sandberg. Set 12 years before the first Annabelle movie, it explores the origin of the Annabelle doll and the horror inflicted upon a group of orphans as a result. Annabelle Creation should have been an absolutely terrible movie. I mean, it's a prequel to a very disappointing prequel spin-off of a horror movie. That kind of thing never turns out well. So even though The Conjuring 2 ended up being really good, I didn't have particularly high hopes for this one. And it didn't seem like anybody else did either, because when I went to see this, I was the only person in the theater. At the time, I had experienced that on a couple occasions, but never for a horror movie, so that definitely added to the experience. As did the worker who unintentionally scared the crap out of me by silently coming up behind me and suddenly talking while I was waiting for the post-credits scene. Maybe it was partly because I had the theater entirely to myself, or maybe it was just because I had such low expectations going in, but I actually quite enjoyed this one that first time I saw it. And I hadn't rewatched it until now, so I was curious to see how it would hold up without the surprised it was actually good boost that I think it got that first time. And I have to say, I still enjoyed this one. Its issues were a little more apparent this time around, but this was a pretty well done movie and a big improvement over the first Annabelle film. That being said, this movie is a bit of an odd mix when it comes to the horror style. It's got the period look and feel that the Conjuring films mastered, this time being set in 1955, but it draws upon modern horror a lot more. It works for the most part, but it has this very mismatched feel to it. And one of the biggest reasons for that is the story itself. The setup for everything just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I know that's going to sound obvious, considering we're talking about a demonic doll movie, but the previous films in this Conjuring universe all did a good job of making the initial situation feel believable. This one's just far-fetched from the start. And I don't even mean anything supernatural or having to do with Annabelle herself. I'm talking about the fact that all of these characters end up at this particular house to begin with. So the scenario itself is just odd, but then we've got some ridiculous character decisions. And I know that's an easy, tired-sounding gripe to have with a horror movie, but the previous Conjuring universe films didn't have all that many stupid character decisions. In fact, for the most part, characters acted sort of reasonably in these movies. They believe each other about the events they're experiencing. They try to leave. They bring in help. Even in the first Annabelle movie, it doesn't take long for them to recognize that something's up with the doll and maybe they shouldn't be around it. Here, characters just repeatedly put themselves in dumb and dangerous situations, even after they've experienced very creepy supernatural things. And so, like many modern horror movies, this ends up being a very frustrating watch for much of the movie, because you're sitting there thinking, what are you doing? The scares in this movie are also kind of a confusing mix between classic and modern horror. At times, it's got the more atmospheric, tension-building horror of The Conjuring, but at other times, it's very blatant with its jump scares and demonic imagery, like the first Annabelle was. And so it kind of falls in the middle of the two in terms of scare tactics. As with its predecessor, I do think this movie would have benefited from leaving some of the, let's say, bigger visuals up to our imaginations. But I will say that, unlike the first Annabelle, this movie is actually scary at times. A lot of the horror moments are telegraphed fairly early in the film, so you're kind of waiting for certain situations to finally happen, but most of them are still effective despite the anticipation. Pretty much any time the doll's in a scene, it puts you on edge. It gets really tense when she's out of focus in the background of a shot, or when we see her on camera, pan away, come back, and she's looking a different direction. Kind of like what I was just saying a minute ago, not seeing something is often far scarier than actually seeing it. And so it's those moments in this movie that really work. You know, we didn't see Annabelle turn her head, but we know she did off camera over there when we were looking over here, and that's maybe creepier than actually seeing her do it. So, if you've seen any of my reviews for the earlier Conjuring universe films, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, is she going to talk about the cinematography? And yes, I am. Once again, a big thumbs up in this department. I mean, we're 4 movies into this universe with 3 different directors and 4 different cinematographers, yet these movies have been consistently well done from a technical standpoint. Just like with all 3 of the previous films, the camera work here is fantastic, utilizing a lot of long takes and introducing us to new locations with one-shot tracking shots that really make us feel like we're there with these characters. Of course, cinematography isn't just camera movement, so there are a lot of other things that are done well here too. Transitions, framing of shots to heighten tension, and a very muted color palette that perfectly encapsulates 1950s farm life. So, Annabelle Creation is a bit of a mixed bag at times, but it's still a fairly decent entry in the Conjuring universe, bridging the stylistic gap between the core Conjuring films and, at the time, the only other spin off. Speaking of bridging within the universe, I also think this movie does an excellent job of connecting the 4 movies in a more concrete way. I imagine some people might not like what they did with the end of this film, but personally, I thought it was a very satisfying tie-in with the first Annabelle movie. That adds a little something extra, and I think improves that film a bit. There are also some minor references to the nun character here, which ties into The Conjuring 2 and sets up the nun solo film. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number 1 is, you've guessed it, the cinematography. I know I'm really starting to sound like a broken record here with these movies, but they just look so good. Maybe it's just a personal preference thing, but I think it's so beneficial and important for a horror movie to connect with its audience. And there are certainly a lot of ways for that to happen, but the cinematography here and in the previous Conjuring universe films does such a good job of enhancing the tension and really putting us in the shoes of our characters by bringing us into the scenes rather than forcing us to view them from afar as outsiders. The second pro is how creepy this movie is. It's definitely a different style of creepy than the core Conjuring films, focusing more on intermittent tension and being dragged down a bit by story and character issues, but I'd be lying if I said there weren't some very creepy moments and unsettling imagery. It's the scenes where you don't actually see the scary thing that are the creepiest. The bunk bed scene is probably the scariest part of this movie for me, and is a great example of this off-camera terror. We're focused on our main character hiding on the top bunk, and even though there's nobody else around, we hear running footsteps, and we just see her terrified face as the bunk bed shakes, because something jumped into the bottom bunk just off camera. By not showing us the scary thing, each of us mentally fills in that gap with something that's personally scary to us, so it ends up being far scarier than it would have been had they shown us something. On the con side here is the story, or at least aspects of it. I actually don't mind any of the stuff related to Annabelle. None of the stuff's particularly creative or different from what you'd expect, but it's not bad. It's the framework around the Annabelle story that bothers me. You know, things like, why is a random family living in the middle of nowhere accepting an orphanage full of kids into their house? I mean, that's a weird premise under any circumstances, but even more ridiculous when you take into account that Annabelle's there, and this family has had a past with that doll. None of it's enough to ruin the movie for me, but story oddities like that do stand out in the moment, and when you're watching it, it's a little distracting. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Annabelle Creation or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm going to give Annabelle Creation 3 out of 5 paws. Although it suffers from some story and character issues, this movie still manages to deliver some decent scares and is a big improvement on the first Annabelle movie. I would recommend Annabelle Creation to people who either liked Annabelle or who like the Annabelle character and want to see a pretty good, scary story involving her. This is a prequel to a prequel, so you don't need to have seen The Conjuring or Annabelle to understand this movie, but this one does offer an interesting perspective change regarding the first Annabelle movie. If you liked Annabelle Creation, I would recommend Ouija Origin of Evil. That was another horror sequel that ended up being a really huge surprise. Much like the first Annabelle film, the first Ouija movie was underwhelming at best, but this one turned it around. Plus, it also starred Lulu Wilson, so there's another connection for you. If you like the Annabelle doll and her story, you may like the first Annabelle movie. It's not exactly a good film, but it does have its moments, plus the ending of this sequel kinda changes the context of that first film a bit, which I think is an interesting improvement. And if you like the moments of unseen horror in this movie, or just the general style, you should check out Lights Out. It was director David F. Sandberg's feature film debut and does an excellent job of scaring you with things that aren't there. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Annabelle Creation? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite sequel that was a big improvement on the original movie? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.